I never thought a leaky faucet could change the way I viewed love, age, and connection. What started as a quick plumbing job turned into something deeper, more unexpected, like finding a note inside a book you almost didn't open. She wasn't like anyone I'd met before, and the question she asked me at the end of it all still echoes in my mind. Would you consider an older woman? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you. Make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The call came on a Monday morning, one of those overcast spring days that didn't seem to make up its mind between drizzle and full and rain. I was in the middle of reorganizing my truck when I saw her number come through. I didn't recognize it at first, but the job note had been left in the queue by my dispatch app. Kitchen faucet, leaking slow drip, maybe loose valve, it said. A routine job. Nothing fancy. Honestly, I'd expected to finish it in under an hour. At most, 2. I pulled into her driveway about an hour later. The house was older, but well-maintained, tucked in a quiet neighborhood about 10 minutes outside of town. The kind of place where the mailboxes still had little red flags you lifted when you sent a letter, and neighbors actually waved from their porches. I liked that. It felt slower, easier. She answered the door with a gentle smile and a calm presence that made me feel like I'd stepped into a quiet song. Her name was Evelyn Mays, late 40s, maybe early 50s, with warm brown eyes and hair streaked tastefully with silver. She wore a soft cardigan and jeans, nothing flashy. But somehow she looked elegant, like someone who didn't have to try very hard to leave an impression. "Thanks for coming," she said, stepping aside to let me in. "The faucet's been misbehaving for a few weeks now. It's not urgent, but it's driving me nuts hearing it drip all night." I followed her into the kitchen, where the steady drip of the faucet sounded like a ticking clock in the stillness of her home. Everything was neat, organized. It's the kind of tidy that felt lived in, not sterile. A framed photo on the counter caught my eye, Evelyn with a younger woman who looked just like her, maybe a daughter. There was a quiet, comforting presence in the space, like time moved differently there as I got to work under the sink. She stayed nearby, leaning against the counter, sipping tea from a chipped mug. At first, it was the usual small talk: weather, the rising price of groceries, how local traffic had gotten worse lately. But then she asked me something unexpected. "Do you ever wonder what your life will look like at 50? I paused mid-tighten and glanced up at her. She wasn't being flirty or provocative. Her tone was sincere, even a little curious, like she was honestly wondering how someone like me saw the future. I shrugged, half laughing. I guess I haven't thought that far ahead. She smiled, but there was something behind it, like a thought she wasn't saying out loud. And in that moment, I realized this wasn't going to be just another faucet fix. There was something about her, about the way she carried herself, that felt layered. Not heavy, not sad, just real. I finished tightening the valve and tested the handle. The drip slowed, then stopped. Satisfied, I stood up and wiped my hands on the rag I kept in my back pocket. "All done?" I said. "Should be good now, but I'll leave my number in case it acts up again." Evelyn nodded, then motioned toward the table. "Would you like a cup of tea before you go? Or coffee, if that's more your style." No more if I would have politely declined. I had another call scheduled an hour later and a few supplies to pick up. But something about her offer felt more like an invitation to breathe than just a polite gesture. So I sat, and she poured us both a cup. Over tea, the conversation drifted into more personal territory. She mentioned her daughter, who'd just moved to another state for graduate school, talked about how the house had grown quieter lately. She said it the way people talk when they haven't had someone to talk to in a while. I listened, not just with my ears, but with that part of you that notices the tremble in someone's voice when they talk about missing something they used to take for granted. And that's when it hit me. This job wasn't about the faucet. Not really. There's something intimate about being in someone's home. You start out a stranger, but if you're paying attention, the details start telling you stories. The photos, the smell of lavender detergent, the way someone folds their napkins or lines up their books. Evelyn wasn't lonely in the tragic, dramatic way, but she was in a quiet, resigned sort of way. It's the kind of lonely that comes from years of caring for others and suddenly finding no one left to care for. And as I sat there, sipping tea with this woman who was clearly used to being the strong one, I felt something shift in me. A softening, maybe. Curiosity. Sense that this day wasn't going to end the way I'd expected. She offered me a small shortbread cookie on a porcelain plate. I hadn't had one since I was a kid. My mother used to make these, she said. Now I make them when I miss her. I took one. And somehow, it felt like I'd just stepped into something deeper than polite hospitality. Like I was being invited to see something most people overlooked. When I finally stood to leave, she walked me to the door. "My face again," she said, her voice soft. It's silly how a little drip can make the house feel off. I nodded, gripping my toolbox. Sometimes the little things matter more than we think. As I turned to go, she hesitated. "Would you mind if I called you again? I've got a couple more things around the house that could use fixing." Smiled. Of course, anytime. And just like that, I was back in my truck, staring at the dashboard, unsure why this particular house, this particular woman, was still lingering in my thoughts. It wasn't about attraction, not entirely. It was something more elusive, like the kind of warmth you feel walking past a bakery on a cold day. Unexpected, familiar, and hard to forget. The following days passed quietly, but Evelyn lingered in my mind in ways I didn't expect. Done 100 house calls before? Maybe more. Some homeowners were chatty, some were barely present, and a few became semi-regular clients. But no one had ever stuck with me like she had. I couldn't tell if it was her kindness, her presence, or just the peaceful silence that seemed to exist around her like a soft current. There was something grounding about being in her home, like stepping out of the rush of the world for a minute. While 3 days after that first visit, my phone buzzed again. Her name lit up the screen. She said her bathroom sink had started to make a gurgling sound and asked if I could take a look sometime that week. I told her I could be there that afternoon. I told myself it was just a job, but I knew I was lying. A little. I wanted to see her again, and not just to check on a noisy pipe. When I pulled into her driveway, it felt like stepping back into a chapter I hadn't finished reading. She opened the door before I even knocked, like she'd been watching for me, or maybe just sensed when I'd arrived. Her smile was easy and warm, not overdone. She wore a dark green sweater that complemented her eyes, and her hair was tied back loosely. She looked like someone who was used to being composed, but comfortable enough around me to let that composure relax a bit. The bathroom sink wasn't a major issue, just a slight clog and some buildup. As I worked, she stood in the hallway just outside the door, occasionally leaning against the wall and asking me questions. Some were about the plumbing, how pipes worked, what the tools did, but some were more personal. She asked if I liked working with my hands, if I always knew I'd do this kind of work, and where I grew up. Her tone was never nosy. It was just interested, like she wanted to understand the person behind the wrench. I told her I'd grown up a few towns over, in a modest neighborhood where houses were close together and sounds traveled through the walls like whispers. My dad had been a mechanic and my mom worked in a diner, both always tired, both doing their best. I started learning to fix things early, mostly because we couldn't afford to call someone else to do it. At first I hated it. But somewhere along the way, the routine of it became comforting. Fixing things made sense. Problems had solutions. Pipes leaked, you tightened them. Circuits tripped, you reset them. Life didn't always work that way. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She nodded as I spoke, like she understood more than I was saying. I finished the job quicker than expected, but instead of rushing off, I lingered. She noticed. She didn't say anything about it, but she offered me another cup of tea, and I accepted without thinking. We sat at her kitchen table again, in the same chairs, with the same quiet comfort around us. She asked me about my family, and I told her I didn't see them much anymore, not because of any bad blood, just distance and time. Life gets in the way sometimes. She nodded, her eyes reflecting something I couldn't quite name. Then she shared something of her own. She said her husband had passed 5 years ago. It wasn't sudden. but it was cruel. Cancer had taken him slowly, and watching him fade had changed her in ways she was still discovering.
As she spoke about.
Him without bitterness, but with a weariness that came from having carried too much grief for too long. I listened. I didn't interrupt. I let the weight of her words settle into the space between us. After a while, she smiled sadly. I don't talk about him much anymore. Not because I don't miss him, but because most people don't know what to say back. I understood that in a way. There are some losses that shift the way you walk through the world. You don't wear them like open wounds, but they never quite heal either. They become part of your shadow. As I finished the last sip of tea, she asked if I'd be willing to take a look at the washer in the laundry room next week. It's not urgent, she said, but it's been a little noisy lately, I told her I'd make time, and as I stood to leave, she walked me to the door again. This time standing a little closer. Her hand brushed mine as she opened the door. A small gesture, probably accidental, but it sent something quiet and electric through me. I didn't make anything of it aloud, but as I walked back to my truck, I found myself wondering what she had felt in that moment, if anything at all. Over the weekend, I caught myself thinking about her more often. The way she listened without judgment, the calm way she moved through her house, the subtle strength behind her sadness. I'd dated younger women before, always full of ambition and energy and noise, and while there was nothing wrong with that, there was something about Evelyn's steadiness that pulled me in. Still, I told myself this was a job. I was just her handyman. It's nothing more but the truth. I wanted to see her again. Not because her washer was noisy, but because sitting across from her, drinking tea, made the world feel less heavy. When Monday came, I found myself arriving a few minutes earlier than scheduled. She greeted me the same way, warm, grounded, like a familiar melody playing in the background of a moment you didn't know you'd remember. I followed her to the laundry room, which was tucked in the back of the house near a small sunroom filled with plants. The washer wasn't making any sound now, and when I told her so, she smiled like she already knew. Maybe it just needed the threat of being looked at, she said with a soft laugh. We both knew why I was there, and it wasn't because of the washer. We spent most of the afternoon in that sunroom, not talking about washers or sinks or repairs, but about everything else. Books, movies, favorite songs, things we missed, things we wished we'd done. And somewhere in the middle of all that, she looked at me with eyes that seemed to see right through the years between us and asked softly, "Do you ever feel older than you are?" I didn't answer right away, because I did. Often. And it felt like she already knew that. When I left that day, I didn't take my usual route back to town. I drove the long way, windows down, letting the breeze carry something out of me I hadn't. Realized I was holding in. Something was changing. I wasn't sure what it meant. Not yet. The days after that visit passed in a quiet blur. I kept busy with other jobs, replacing a busted water heater in the next town over, unclogging a drain. At an office downtown, even helping an old couple install a ceiling fan, but none of those jobs lingered the way Evelyn's did. I'd catch myself remembering the way she tilted her head when she listened, or how the sunlight filtered through her sunroom plants like little shards of gold. I wasn't used to feeling this unsettled, and yet it wasn't discomfort, it was anticipation. A low hum beneath everything I did, like waiting for a song to come back on. I told myself that I'd wait for her to call again. I wasn't about to force anything. But 2 days later, the message came through. A text this time. "Hey, if you're not too busy, the cabinet door under the sink is a bit loose. No rush, just whenever you're nearby." It was such a small thing, a cabinet door. A job that any homeowner could probably fix with a screwdriver and some patience. But I knew what she meant. I knew I wanted to be there. I messaged back that I'd be in the area that afternoon and could stop by. No problem. Her reply came. Quickly. Perfect. I'll put the kettle on. When I arrived, she greeted me with a warmth that no longer felt like politeness. It felt like familiarity, like the way someone smiles at a person they're relieved to see again. The house smelled faintly of cinnamon, and there was a soft jazz record playing in the background, kind of music that doesn't ask for your attention but pulls you in anyway. The cabinet job took less than 10 minutes. The hinge had just loosened from wear. I tightened it, checked the alignment, and stood up. But neither of us moved to say goodbye. Instead, she offered me a plate of cookies and tea again. And I followed her to the sunroom, like we'd already settled into this routine that neither of us was ready to name. The sunlight was stronger that day, casting gentle shadows across the floor. The air smelled like rosemary from one of her potted plants. We sat, and for a long while we didn't say anything. The silence was rich, not awkward, but layered. With meaning, eventually she spoke. She told me she used to work as a librarian before her husband got sick. Said she'd always loved the quiet of libraries, the sense that stories were just waiting in the walls. She missed that feeling, the potential of discovery. I told her that's why I liked fixing things. There's a kind of storytelling in repairs too. You find the problem, trace it back, understand why it happened, and then you make it right. She liked that metaphor more than I expected. Then she asked about my life again, not just where I came from, but where I thought I was going. I didn't have a clear answer, admitted that I wasn't sure, so that I'd been drifting a little. Jobs paid the bills. The work kept my hands busy. But lately, I felt like I was patching more than pipes. I was patching time. Patching a version of myself I hadn't yet become. She looked at me for a long moment. Her eyes soft but sharp, like she was searching through me. And then she said something I didn't expect. You carry things, don't you? Things you don't talk about. I nodded, because I didn't know what else to do. She was right. I carried a lot of disappointments, regrets, questions I didn't have answers to. And she wasn't asking me to unpack it all, just acknowledging that she saw the wait. It was the first time in a long time I felt that kind of recognition. Not pity, not curiosity. It's just honest seeing. We stayed in that room for over an hour, talking about nothing and everything. It's a kind of conversation that loops back around itself. Comfortable in the meandering, she told me about a garden she used to have before her knees got bad. I told her about my failed attempt to adopt a stray dog that ended with me covered in mud and scratches. She really laughed, and it was one of the most unguarded sounds I'd ever heard from her. It made me laugh too, and for a few minutes, the world outside that sunroom faded into static. When I left, she walked me out again, but this time she didn't let go of the door right away. She leaned against the frame and said, "You know, I didn't expect you to keep showing up. Most people don't." I looked at her, unsure how to answer. So I just said, "I'm not most people." She smiled at that, not the polite kind, the kind that meant something. That night I didn't sleep well, not because I was anxious, but because my mind kept replaying the way she looked at me, the way she saw past my guardrails and didn't flinch. I wasn't used to that. I was used to being useful, not seen. A few days passed, and I found myself wishing the faucet would start. Dripping again, or the washer would groan, or anything would need fixing. And then it happened, but not in the way I expected. She called me on a Saturday morning. Her voice on the line was calm, but had a slight tremble underneath. She said her car wouldn't start and asked if I knew anything about engines. I told her I knew enough to take a look and that I'd be there soon. When I arrived, she was standing in the driveway, hair pulled back in a messy bun, cardigan thrown over a loose t-shirt and jeans. She looked tired, not in a bad way, but like she'd been thinking too much and sleeping too little. I popped the hood and started checking the basics. Turns out the battery connection had just come loose. I tightened it, checked the charge, and the car started with a low hum. She stood beside me the whole time, quiet at first, then said, "It's strange, you know. For years I had someone who took care of these little things. When he was gone, I didn't realize how many things I stopped asking for help with. I didn't say anything right away. I just closed the hood and turned to her. "You don't have to apologize for needing help," I said eventually. "That's what people are for," she nodded, then added almost hesitantly, "Sometimes I forget how to let people in." There it was, again that quiet truth she dropped like pebbles in a pond, letting the ripples reach me in their own time. We didn't go inside right away. We stood in the driveway, the late morning sun warming the pavement beneath our feet, and talked about the things people forget to say out loud. Trust, healing, what it means to be alone. and what it takes to stop being afraid of that. I was just about to leave when she looked at me and said, "Would you want to come by tomorrow?" I was thinking of trying a new recipe, and it's no fun cooking for one. Said yes before I had the chance to think of reasons not to, because there were no good reasons anymore. As I drove away, the wind in my open window, I realized something. Whatever this was becoming, it had already started changing me. Sunday arrived with the kind of quiet that made the whole world feel like it was holding its breath. There was no rush in the streets, no hum of weekday errands or early alarms, just stillness. The kind of day that invited you to slow down and notice things you usually pass by. I woke earlier than usual, restless but calm, like something new was waiting for me, and I didn't want to be late. I shaved, cleaned up the inside of my truck, even changed my shirt twice before settling on a dark gray one that didn't look like I was trying too hard. It was just dinner, I told myself, just a meal. But I knew it was more when I pulled into Evelyn's driveway. She was already on the porch, wiping her hands on a kitchen towel. She smiled, and for a moment, the whole scene felt like a snapshot from some simpler life I didn't realize I'd been craving. She led me into the house, and the smell of roasted vegetables, garlic, and something warm and buttery filled the air. She moved around the kitchen with the kind of grace that comes from years of doing something out of love, not obligation. There was music playing softly, something old, mellow, and full of strings, and her hair was tucked behind her ears, loose strands falling across her cheek as she checked the oven. I offered to help, but she waved me off gently. "You've done enough fixing this week. Tonight, you just sit." So I did, sat at the little table in her kitchen, watching her cook and listening to the quiet rhythm of her movements. It felt almost sacred, like I was witnessing something she hadn't shared in a long time. Not the act of cooking, but the vulnerability of letting someone be near while she did. Dinner was simple roast chicken, vegetables, and a small salad she said she threw together at the last minute. But it tasted better than anything I'd eaten in months. Maybe it was the company. Maybe it was the silence between our words. Maybe it was the fact that, for the first time in a while, I felt like I belonged somewhere, even if just for the evening. We talked through the meal. Not in rushed conversation, but in gentle waves. She asked about the places I'd worked, the towns I'd passed through, the people I'd met. I told her a story about an old man in a trailer park who paid me in home-brewed beer and fishing lures. She laughed, not just at the story, but with the kind of laugh that reaches the eyes and lingers. I asked her what she missed most about her old life, before things got quieter. She said she missed sharing meals, not because she couldn't cook for herself, but because food always tasted better when it was shared. After dinner, we sat in the sunroom again. The light outside was fading, casting everything in amber and deep blue. The air smelled faintly of rosemary and rain. I noticed a blanket folded over the back of her chair and reached for it when she shivered slightly. She accepted it with a soft thank you, her fingers brushing mine again, not accidental this time. Deliberate, measured, charged with something we still hadn't named. We talked until the stars began to show, about time, regret, the weird way memories change shape as you get older. She admitted that, for a while after her husband passed, she thought she was done with connection. That maybe the rest of her life would be about learning how to be alone gracefully. But then she said something that caught me off guard. I didn't expect to feel something again, not like this, not with you. I didn't answer right away. I couldn't. The truth of her words hit me in a place I hadn't opened in years. I'd told myself I was fine with passing through life quietly, fixing things and moving on. But sitting next to her, under the quiet hush of her home, I realized how wrong I'd been. She turned to face me more fully, her voice softer than before. "Does it scare you?" I looked at her and shook my head. "No, but it surprises me." She nodded like she understood, like she felt the same way. There was no kiss, no dramatic moment. Just the kind of silence that fills the space between two people when something shifts. We didn't need to say anything more. The air between us said enough. When I finally stood to leave, it felt like stepping out of a dream I didn't want to wake from. She walked me to the door, her fingers grazing my arm for a moment longer than necessary. And just as I stepped onto the porch, she asked it, "Would you consider an older woman?" Her voice wasn't playful or teasing. It was sincere, honest. vulnerable in a way that demanded a real answer, not a clever one. I turned to face her. She looked steady, but I could see the flicker of uncertainty behind her eyes, like she was bracing for rejection, already preparing to laugh it off if I said the wrong thing. I didn't give her a joke or a vague answer. I just said yes, I would. Her shoulders relaxed, just slightly, enough for me to see how tightly she'd been holding herself together. She smiled, not a wide grin, but something softer, something real. Good, she said, because I'm not asking for anything fast. I want to know if this is something we're both walking into. I nodded, one step at a time, and that was it. No grand promises, no declarations. Just two people acknowledging that something had begun, something neither of us had planned for, both felt too deeply to ignore. As I drove home that night, the road stretched out ahead of me like a ribbon of possibility. For the first time in a long time, the silence in my truck didn't feel empty. It felt full of hope, of questions, something I couldn't quite name but was ready to explore. This wasn't just about fixing a faucet anymore. It was about opening a door. Neither of us had realized we'd closed, and this time, neither of us was alone on the other side of it. The days that followed carried a kind of subtle shift, like the difference between a house and a home. I went about my usual routine appointments, repairs, lunch eaten in the cab of my truck, but something in me felt different, steadier, warmer. My thoughts drifted often, uninvited but welcome, to Evelyn. Not to the moment she asked me that question, though that had branded itself onto my memory like a watermark, but to the smaller things. The way she sipped her tea with both hands, like she needed the warmth. How her laugh carried a slight rasp at the end, as if it hadn't been used often enough. Or the way her eyes seemed to take in more than just what was in front of her. She didn't look at you. She read you. We didn't text constantly. A message here, a short call there. She wasn't one for long phone conversations, and I'd never been good at small talk. But the silence between communications never felt like distance, it felt like patience. As if we were both letting whatever was blooming take its time. No pressure, no expectations. It's just quiet anticipation. Then, midweek, she asked if I could come by and help her move some things in the garage. She said she wanted to reorganize, maybe donate a few boxes to a local shelter. I said yes, of course, even before I checked my calendar. I didn't need to pretend I was coming just for the job anymore. And that was freeing in a way I hadn't felt in years. When I arrived that Friday afternoon, the garage door was already open. Sunlight spilled in at a sharp angle, catching the dust motes and golden beams that made the space feel almost sacred. Evelyn stood in the corner near a pile of boxes, dressed in worn jeans and a light flannel shirt rolled up to her elbows. Her hair was pulled into a ponytail, loose strands curling near her neck. She looked up when she saw me and smiled. It wasn't just a greeting, it was a recognition. It's like I was someone who belonged in her world now. We spent the first hour going through boxers' books, holiday decorations, a few old tools. Some of it she sorted easily, but every now and then she'd pause over something and hold it just a little too long. A ceramic Christmas ornament shaped like a small train made her go quiet. She told me it had belonged to her husband. He'd loved trains as a boy, dreamed of being a conductor. She didn't cry, and she didn't smile. She just let the memory be what it was, and then gently placed the ornament in the keep pile. There were pictures, too. Old photo albums filled with frozen moments, family barbecues, vacations, snapshots of a life lived with someone else. I didn't press, didn't ask questions. I let her tell me what she wanted to and stayed quiet for the rest. Sometimes company means knowing when not to speak. After a while, we sat on a pair of overturned crates sipping lemonade she'd brought out in tall glasses. The sun had shifted, casting long shadows across the concrete floor. The air smelled like old wood and citrus, and something faintly floral. Probably the lingering scent of whatever perfume she wore that day. She turned to me after a stretch of quiet and said something that felt like another step down a road we hadn't yet mapped. Do you think people can start over? Not in the dramatic way, but just quietly, without blowing up their whole life. I considered her question carefully. It's not just what to say, but how to say it. I think we do it all the time, I said. We just don't always notice until we're already halfway into the new beginning. She nodded slowly, letting the thoughts settle. I've spent so much time being still, I forgot what it feels like to move forward. You're not still, I told her. You've just been waiting for the right direction. It wasn't meant to be romantic, but I saw the way her eyes shifted slightly, like I'd struck a chord she wasn't expecting. She looked down at her hands, then back at me, and said, "Sometimes I don't know if I'm brave or just tired." That sat between us for a long moment, because I understood it deeply. "I think you're both," I said. "Oh." And both are allowed. The rest of the afternoon was slow and unhurried. We finished organizing, stacked the boxes in the corner, and swept the floor. She showed me an old bike that used to belong to her niece, now gathering dust behind a rack of garden tools. We laughed when I nearly tripped over a box labeled mystery stuff, which turned out to be a collection of mismatched socks and one garden gnome. As the sun dipped lower, we found ourselves back in the kitchen. She reheated some soup she'd made the night before and offered me a bowl. We sat at the table again, side by side this time, instead of across from each other. There was a quiet intimacy in that arrangement, no table between us, no distance. When I stood to leave, she walked me to the door like always. But this time, she didn't stay on the threshold. She stepped outside with me, arms crossed loosely, her expression unreadable, but not closed off. "I like when you're here," she said finally. "It's not just the help. It's something else. You make the house feel less empty." I took a slow breath. I wanted to tell her she made my world feel less aimless, less like I was just fixing things to pass the time. But the words didn't come easily, so I just said, "I like being here." That seemed to be enough. She nodded, then reached out and touched my arm lightly. Just a moment, but enough to let me know the space between us was narrowing, slowly, gently that night. I wanted to sit in the quiet and let the shape of the day settle into me. I realized that what was happening wasn't a romance in the usual sense. It wasn't fast or fiery. It wasn't about grand gestures or passionate declarations. It was about presence. It's about choosing to show up, again and again. And I also realized this story wasn't just hers. It was becoming ours. The next few days passed with a quiet rhythm, a gentle hum beneath my usual routine that hadn't been there before Evelyn. The world around me looked the same, jobs still came in, traffic still crawled along the same familiar streets. The hardware store still smelled like sawdust and solvent, but inside me, something was subtly realigning. It wasn't dramatic or overwhelming, just steady. A shift that made the days feel less like a countdown and more like steps toward something worth reaching. I hadn't realized how much of my life I had spent drifting until now, when a tether finally appeared, soft golden one, rooted in the warm corner of Evelyn's world. She didn't call me that week, but I didn't take it as distance. I felt no anxiety about it, no need to fill the silence with idle messages. I think we both understood by now that this wasn't about frequency, but depth. And when she did reach out again, it was on a Tuesday morning with a message that simply read, "I bought a new light fixture for the hallway feel, like doing a bit of ceiling work." I smiled before I even finished reading it. There was no rush in her words, no forced pretense. It's just a quiet invitation. It's a kind that said, "I'd like you here if you have the time." When I arrived, she answered the door in bare feet, wearing an old denim shirt over a white tank top and linen pants. Her hair was slightly damp, probably from a shower not long before. She looked at home, comfortable in her skin in a way that I rarely saw in people. It was one of the things I admired most about her. She didn't perform her existence for anyone. She led me down the hallway, pointing at the old brass fixture that had long since lost its shine. "It's time," she said with a faint smile. "This thing hasn't worked right since 2006. The job was simple enough, mechanically speaking. I got to work while she stayed nearby, asking questions here and there how I knew which wires to test. Why I always carried my own screws instead of using the ones provided, whether I preferred LED or warm incandescent light. Was the kind of idle, curious conversation you share when you're building not just a fixture, but familiarity. Halfway through the task, she brought out 2 glasses of lemonade and stood beside me, watching as I balanced on the step stool, tightening the final screw. "You know," she said quietly, "I thought I'd be alone for the rest of my life. not in a sad way, just peacefully resigned. Like I'd made peace with my own company. I didn't respond right away. I didn't want to cut her off or fill the space with something hollow. I came down from the stool, stepped aside, and flipped the switch. The new light came on with a soft, warm glow. It bathed the narrow hallway in something almost golden, casting delicate shadows on the picture frames lining the wall. "That's better," she said, still looking at the light. I nodded. "It is." We stood there a moment longer, neither of us saying anything, just looking at that small, fixed thing and what it seemed to represent. A choice to brighten the space, a little act of intention. We moved to the kitchen not long after, where she reheated some soup and cut a few slices of crusty bread. We ate in the sunroom again, though the day was overcast and the light a little more muted than usual. There was something cozier about it, though like the world was gently pressing in around us, making the space we shared feel more defined. She told me more about her past this time. It's about her childhood in a small coastal town, the salt air that always clung to her clothes, the way she used to walk barefoot down the gravel path to the docks. Her parents had been quiet people, solid and reliable. Her father fixed boats. Her mother made quilts and had an uncanny ability to remember everyone's birthday in the neighborhood. Evelyn had left that town for college, then for marriage, and eventually for this city. She didn't regret it, but she missed the sound of gulls in the morning. I listened, not just politely, but fully, because I realized something else that afternoon. When she spoke, she wasn't just giving me details, she was giving me keys. Tiny glimpses into the rooms she rarely let anyone enter. And I wanted to keep them safe. After we'd eaten, I helped her clean the dishes. Our movements were easy now, like people who'd done this a dozen times. I dried the plates while she scrubbed, and at one point, our hands brushed again. Her fingers wet and mine warm from the dish towel. This time, neither of us pulled away. She looked at me then, holding my gaze longer than usual. And for the first time since this began, I could feel the question in the air, not spoken, not even shaped, but present, a silent wondering. Are we doing here? What is this? Later, we sat in the living room, no music this time. Just the soft ticking of the wall clock and the occasional hum of traffic beyond the windows. She curled her legs beneath her on the couch and asked me if I believed people could fall in love quietly, without fireworks or fanfare. I thought about it, yeah, I said slowly. Sometimes it starts with noticing, then it becomes comfort. And then, if you're lucky, it becomes the kind of love that doesn't need proving. She nodded, not looking at me. I think I might be on the edge of something. I didn't press her to say more. I just said, "Me too." And we left it at that. The evening wore on, and when it was time for me to leave, she stood at the door again, just like always. But this time, before I stepped out, she reached up, smoothed a strand of hair away from my forehead, and said, "You make things better." Not just things, spaces, people. I didn't have words for that, so I just smiled. And that, I think, was enough. That night, in bed, I stared at the ceiling long after the room had gone dark. The question she'd asked earlier looped through my head about quiet love, and I realized I'd stopped thinking about whether this was too soon or too complicated or too different. It didn't feel like any of that anymore. It just felt right. The next few weeks unfolded like pages in a journal, quiet, tensional, unhurried. Evelyn and I didn't label anything, and I think that's what made it all feel so real. There were no grand confessions or forced moments, just the steady accumulation of shared time. Morning coffee in her sunroom, on days I finished early. Late afternoon walks through her neighborhood where the air smelled like cut grass and the faint sweetness of blooming gardenia. I began to notice things I hadn't before, not just about her, but about myself too. The way I leaned in when she spoke. The way my days felt longer when I didn't see her. The way even the silence between us carried a kind of electricity that didn't demand to be filled, only acknowledged. I fixed a few more things around her house during that stretch of time. A loose floorboard in the laundry room. A faulty latch on the back gate. An uneven kitchen drawer that used to stick no matter how gently you pulled. Each task was small, but each one gave me an excuse to be near her, to observe the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was focused, or how she hummed low and absent-mindedly while writing out grocery lists. These weren't repairs that demanded my presence, but I was beginning to realize something. She didn't ask me just because she needed help. She asked because I made the house feel full again. And I kept saying yes because being there made me feel less like I was drifting through life and more like I had arrived at something worth staying for. One morning, she surprised me with tickets to a small local art exhibit. She said she used to love going to those kinds of things, but over time it felt strange walking through galleries alone. She thought maybe I'd appreciate the craftsmanship behind it all, the attention to texture, the subtle precision. I wasn't sure if I was really the art type, but I said yes without hesitation. We went on a Sunday, just before noon. The place was quiet, the kind of quiet that's curated soft lighting. Delicate instrumental music playing in the background, muted footsteps on polished floors. Evelyn moved through the space like she belonged in it, stopping often, tilting her head slightly at certain paintings. She didn't explain what she liked. She just looked, smiled faintly, and let it be. That's something I'd noticed about her more and more. She didn't feel the need to fill space with commentary. She trusted presence to do the heavy lifting. There was a moment near the back of the gallery. In front of a piece that showed a faded shoreline at dusk where she reached for my hand. Yet, not dramatically, not even with certainty. Just a soft, barely there gesture that said, "I'm here, if you are too." And I took it, gently, quietly. We stood like that for a long time, hands laced, eyes fixed on brushstrokes that somehow felt like memories neither of us had lived, but both could recognize. Afterwards, we went for coffee, sitting outside beneath a rustling canopy of oak trees. The air was warm but not heavy, the kind of spring heat that hinted at summer's approach without fully committing to it. She stirred honey into her tea, watching the spirals form and dissolve, then glanced up at me and said, "I like the way you see things." I wasn't sure what she meant exactly, but I didn't ask. Instead, I told her something I hadn't planned to say, something that had been forming quietly at the edges of my thoughts for a while. "You make everything feel slower," I said, not in a bad way. In a way that makes me notice life again. She looked at me for a moment, eyes soft, like she was memorizing not just the words but the way I said them. "I think," she replied, "you were meant to arrive exactly when you did." That night, we didn't part at the door. We ended up on her porch swing, a soft breeze swaying us just enough to keep time. The sky was clear, and stars were scattered overhead like a quiet kind of confetti. She leaned into me, head resting lightly on my shoulder. No words passed between us for a long while. Just the steady creak of the swing, the whisper of wind in the trees, and the quiet thump of her pulse against my arm. Eventually, she said, almost in a whisper, "It's strange, isn't it? The way connection can sneak up on you, even after. You thought you were done with all that?" I nodded. "Yeah, but maybe we're never really done, just waiting for the right kind." She tilted her head to look up at me. Her eyes held that same quiet courage they'd had when she asked the first question, the one that started all this. "Do you think this is the right kind?" "I do," I said simply. There was a comfort in that, in not needing to explain it, in not having to name what was still unfolding. When I finally stood to leave, we didn't hug or kiss or make promises. She just squeezed my hand and I squeezed back. That was enough. On the drive home, I realized something else. No, this wasn't just a story about whether I could fall for an older woman. It wasn't about age or labels or complications. It was about timing, about who we become when the right person sees us clearly and chooses to stay, and about how sometimes the most unexpected doors lead to the most honest kind of home. The days that followed weren't marked by milestones or declarations, but by the quiet stitching together of something that already felt like a shared life. Evelyn and I didn't talk about what we were or what we were becoming. We didn't need to. Everything between us moved with a pace that was both deliberate and unspoken. Like a tide rising so slowly you didn't notice you were already waist deep. And in that stillness, in the absence of pressure, I found something I hadn't known. I needed a sense of belonging that didn't have to prove itself, didn't have to explain. We spent more time together without making it official. I'd show up with groceries she didn't ask for fresh fruit.
Nice.
bread from the corner bakery, her favorite chamomile tea, and she'd smile like I'd given her something far more precious than food. Sometimes she'd call and say the light, and the hallway flickered again just to get me over for coffee. Other times we wouldn't see each other for a couple of days, but when we did, it was always easy. It's like picking up a book and remembering exactly where you left off. One evening, I brought over a film I thought she might like, a quiet, slow-paced drama set in Tuscany about two people finding themselves late in life. She curled up beside me on the couch with her feet tucked under a throw blanket, and as the story unfolded, I could feel her glance at me in the dim light. Not for attention, but for reassurance. Her head rested on my shoulder by the time the credits rolled, and I didn't dare move. Outside, rain began tapping against the windows, a soft percussion that gave the room its own rhythm. When the movie ended, she turned to me and said something that caught me off guard, not because it was dramatic, but because of its raw simplicity. I haven't let anyone in this far. Not since he passed. I didn't need to ask who he was. Her husband had become a quiet presence in our story, not a shadow, but a part of the architecture. I nodded slowly, taking her hand in mine. "I'm not trying to replace anyone," I said. "Just trying to be real with you." "Ends up meaning—" She smiled, and the look in her eyes wasn't sad, it was grateful. Not for what I said, but for the fact that I understood the space she needed to keep between past and present. Love doesn't erase, it layers. The next weekend, she invited me to a community garden fair near her old neighborhood. It was the kind of event I'd normally avoid: loud music, kids running wild, pop-up booths selling homemade jams and artisan soap, but seeing her in that setting, light on her feet, waving at old friends who still remembered her by her maiden name, I realized how little I knew of the chapters that had shaped her, and I wanted to know them all. We walked between stalls, sampled food, and at one point she pulled me toward a vendor selling used books, her eyes lighting up at the sight of an old hardcover she used to own in college. She bought it without hesitation, holding it close like she'd recovered a piece of her youth. I asked her what it meant to her, and she told me it was the first book that ever made her cry, not from sadness, but from recognition. I saw myself in it, she said softly. At a time when I didn't even know who I was yet, that stuck with me. How deeply she felt things, how she didn't flinch from emotional truth. It made me admire her more, and also made me realize how guarded I'd been in my own life, how often I'd kept things light to avoid the weight of being vulnerable. After the fair, we sat on a bench beneath a canopy of trees, sipping iced tea, and letting the noise of the event fade behind us. She turned to me, eyes narrowed thoughtfully, and said, "I used to think people only got one great love in life. But now I wonder if maybe love just changes form, and sometimes, if we're lucky, it returns in a shape we can hold again." I didn't answer right away. Was too caught in the honesty of the moment, in the way her words seemed to bypass logic and strike something deeper. "I think love comes in seasons," I finally said. "And maybe the trick isn't to hold on too tightly to any one version of it, but to be open when a new one arrives." She nodded, and the smile she gave me then wasn't romantic or flirtatious. It was something quieter, a kind of trust. That evening, we went back to her place, and I stayed for dinner. It's nothing fancy, grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup, but we ate like it was a celebration. There was laughter, easy silences, even a moment where she put on a record and danced. With me in the kitchen, her cheek against mine, the smell of rosemary soap still lingering on her skin, the steady beat of a jazz guitar weaving through the background. It was all so ordinary and so quietly profound that I felt the moment anchor itself inside me. After dinner, we sat on the back porch. The sun had dipped low and fireflies had begun to emerge from the tall grass near the fence. She pointed them out, her voice hushed, like we were witnessing something sacred. Maybe we were. Not because of the fireflies, but because of how natural it felt to share that stillness. Then she turned to me, her voice soft but clear. "Can I ask you something a little personal?" I nodded, unsure of where it would go, but ready for whatever. It was, would you ever consider being with someone older? Like really consider it not just as a passing thought, but as a choice. There it was. The question. The one that had hovered between us like smoke for weeks. I didn't flinch. I didn't joke. I just looked at her, this woman with her quiet strength and worn-in softness, her grief and grace and the courage to ask what most would leave unspoken. And I said, I already have. She didn't reply. She just leaned forward and rested her forehead against mine, and in that closeness, I felt something settle. Not a decision, not a conclusion. What a knowing. Whatever this was becoming, it was real. The question lingered in the air between us, even after it had been asked, even after I'd answered. It wasn't just about age, and we both knew that. It was about choosing someone who came with a life already lived, with stories that didn't include you, with aches you hadn't witnessed and joys you hadn't shared. Evelyn's question wasn't a plea for validation. It was a quiet challenge to see her fully and decide. If I could step into that complexity without trying to change or soften it, and I had. Maybe I hadn't said the words with ceremony, but I had made the choice every time I showed up, every time I lingered longer than needed. Every time I listened to her stories like they were maps instead of baggage. The next morning, I found myself waking up earlier than usual. It's a kind of morning where the sun isn't up yet, but you can feel it thinking about rising. I made coffee and sat on the edge of my bed, her question echoing in the quiet. I had meant what I said. I already had considered it. But now, after hearing the weight of her voice when she asked it, I realized something deeper. Evelyn wasn't afraid of being alone. She had mastered solitude like it was a second language. What she feared was giving herself permission to let someone in and finding out they couldn't carry the gravity of what that meant. But she had unwrapped her trust slowly, not because she was unsure, but because she knew how much it cost to rebuild. After someone drops it, that day I had a few odd jobs lined up. I tried to give them my full attention, tightening bolts, placing cracked tiles, fixing a garage sensor, but my mind kept circling back to her porch, to the smell of her hair when she leaned in close, to the way her fingers had trembled ever so slightly when she touched my hand after asking her question. It wasn't nerves, it was honesty. I could still feel the outline of her voice in my chest by late afternoon. I finished my last job, and instead of going home, I drove toward her neighborhood. I hadn't told her I was coming, and I didn't bring tools or excuses. I just needed to see her, not for work, not for dinner, just to be with her. When I pulled up to her house, I noticed the gate was open. The front door was cracked slightly. From inside, I could hear soft music playing piano, slow and tender, like fingers brushing across memory. I knocked gently and called out, not wanting to startle her. She appeared in the hallway, barefoot, again, wearing a navy blue sweater and jeans. Her hair pulled back into a loose bun that let a few strands fall against her cheek. She smiled when she saw me. I was just thinking about you. I stepped inside, and for a moment we just stood there in the foyer, the music wrapping around us like warmth. No tools today, I said, just me. That's enough, she replied. We moved to the living room and sat side by side on the couch. Outside, the wind played with the branches of the old oak tree in her yard, its shadow dancing across the window like a silent film. She handed me a mug of tea chamomile, my new favorite because of her, and asked how my day had been. I told her the truth, that the jobs had been fine, but that none of them felt like they mattered until I saw her. She looked at me for a long moment, her eyes reflecting something deeper than affections, something closer to awe, like she was seeing a part of herself she hadn't recognized in a while reflected back in my expression. You're not afraid of this, she said quietly. I'm not, I replied. I think I was before I met you. Not because of you, but because I thought I had to follow some plan, some timeline that made sense to everyone but me. She leaned her head against my shoulder. I've lived a whole life already. Marriage, raising a kid, losing a partner, rebuilding everything. I didn't think there'd be anything left for me like this. I'm not here to erase what came before, I said. I just want to be part of what comes next. We sat in that stillness for a while, and then she did something she rarely did. She brought out an old photo album. We sat at the dining table, flipping through worn pages, each picture a portal to a moment frozen in time. There were photos of her as a young woman on the beach, laughing with wind-tossed hair, of her wedding day, eyes shining with a different kind of love, of her holding her newborn son, exhausted and luminous all at once. She told me about each one without apology, without trying to filter or edit. I listened not just to the facts, but to the pauses between them, to the way her voice softened. When she mentioned her late husband, to the pride in her tone, when she spoke about raising her son alone after he passed. She had carried so much and never once asked the world to make it easier. She simply adjusted her grip and kept walking. At one point, she looked up from the album and said, "Are you sure you want to be part of this mosaic of past and present? It's not a blank slate." "I don't want a blank slate," I said. "I want something that's real." And she smiled. Not the kind of smile that ends a conversation, but the kind that opens a door. Later that night, as I prepared to leave, she followed me to the porch. We stood in the same spot we always did, only this time, she didn't reach for a hug or wait for me to lean in first. She kissed me, softly, with the kind of tenderness that speaks of trust more than passion, of slow certainty rather than impulsive need. It was a kiss that asked nothing and offered everything. When we parted, she whispered, "Thank you for not treating me like a phase." "You're not a phase," I said. "You're the first thing that's felt permanent in a long time." She watched me walk to my truck, and as I drove away, I didn't feel like I was leaving. I felt like I was returning to something not quite named yet, but undeniably alive. The days that followed that kiss settled into a rhythm so natural it felt as though we'd always existed in that in-between space. That beautiful overlap where affection isn't loud but constant. Evelyn and I didn't need to define what was happening, not yet, maybe not ever. There was something sacred about letting it breathe on its own, trusting the connection to shape itself instead of forcing it into a form it wasn't ready for. Still, everything felt different now. The casualness that had once defined our early encounters had shifted into something deeper, something that lingered in the smallest of gestures, look held just a little longer, a touch that stayed a second, too long to be accidental, a quiet that no longer felt awkward. I found myself looking forward to her voice every morning, even if it was just a text or a call, asking if I wanted to join her for a walk or bring over some leftover soup she'd made. She always said it was too much for one, but I began to suspect she made extra on purpose, and I didn't mind. In fact, it became the highlight of my day, those small invitations that came not out of need, but out of desire to share, to be seen, to not be alone. For someone like her, who had built a life around self-reliance and resilience, I knew how much it meant to ask someone in. One particular afternoon, I arrived with no tools, no job, just a bag of groceries and a bottle, a wine I'd picked up from a roadside shop. She answered the door in an apron dusted with flour, her face flushed from the oven's heat and her hair pinned up in that loose way she always wore when she was deep in her kitchen. The house smelled like garlic, rosemary, and something faintly sweet baking in the background. She laughed when she saw me, taking the groceries without hesitation, setting them on the counter like it had always been our shared space. We cooked together for the first time that day, not in a choreographed, a romantic montage kind of way, but in the honest, chaotic way real people cook. She corrected my knife technique. I teased her for burning the first batch of bread. We spilled sauce. She bumped into me when I tried to reach a spice above her head. It was a mess, but it was beautiful. Somewhere between the chopping, stirring, and laughter, it hit me just how comfortable I'd become in her world, and how much I wanted to stay. Later that night, after the dishes were washed and the candles had burned low, we sat on the couch sipping the wine. The conversation had slowed, not from exhaustion, but from that mutual contentment that doesn't need to be filled. I watched her as she gazed out the window, her profile illuminated by the soft amber glow of a nearby lamp. Well, she looked peaceful, and it was in that moment, in that silence, that she spoke. "There's something I haven't told you," she said quietly. I set my glass down, not out of fear, but out of respect. She wasn't the kind to speak without intention, I've been offered a job. Not full-time, but something meaningful. It's out of town, though 3 hours away. A community arts center wants me to curate a small gallery exhibit. They heard about my work through an old colleague. I looked at her, trying to gauge whether she was excited or conflicted. Her expression gave me nothing and everything all at once. "That's incredible," I said honestly. "Is it something you want to do?" She hesitated, swirling the wine in her glass. "It is, but it's temporary 6 weeks. Maybe longer, depending on how it goes. I'd be staying there for the duration. They've offered accommodations. It's a big deal for me, and I knew it was, not just because of the opportunity, but because she was considering stepping out of this new rhythm we'd created. It wasn't a betrayal, it was life knocking, and life rarely waits. I leaned back and nodded slowly. "So go." She turned to me, eyes wide, as if surprised by my response. "You think I should?" "I think you'd regret it if you didn't," I said. "And I think you're allowed to want something for yourself without apologizing for it." She studied me for a moment, the corners of her mouth twitching like she was holding back a smile. "You really mean that?" "I do. And I'll still be here when you get back, if that's something you want." That was the thing with us. There were no ultimatums, no expectations, just honesty and faith. She left 2 weeks later, drove her to the train station, carried her bag, and kissed her goodbye on the platform without dramatics. We promised to talk, to share photos, to stay connected, and we did. Every night we'd video chat, sharing pieces of our day. She'd tell me about the artists she was working with, stories behind the pieces, the community she was slowly getting to know. I'd update her on the odd jobs I was doing, the neighbors asking about her, the tomatoes starting to ripen in her garden, but it wasn't easy. There were days I missed her more than I expected. Days when I'd reach for my phone just to see if she'd sent a message, just to feel close to something that had become so intertwined with my daily life. I missed her humming while doing dishes, the way she'd narrate her thoughts when she was planning a meal, the curve of her smile when she found something funny. The silence, even that comfortable kind of silence we'd learned to share. And I knew during those weeks apart that I wasn't just missing her presence. I was missing what we had become, whatever name we chose to give it. Then one night, during our usual call, she looked more tired than usual, not defeated, just worn. I asked if everything was okay, and she hesitated before answering. "I love the work," she said. "It's fulfilling, but I miss my life. The one with you in it." I didn't say anything right away, just let her words hang there, real and bare. Then I said, "Come home." And she smiled. She returned 2 days later. Because the job ended, but because she chose to end it early. She said what she had found with me was more permanent than anything she was chasing out there. And as she stepped through her front door, duffel bag slung over her shoulder, hair tousled from travel, I saw her not as someone older or someone different, but as someone who had chosen me just as I had chosen her. That night, I didn't leave. Not out of assumption or impulse, but because it felt right, because every room in that house felt like it had been waiting to be filled again, because home wasn't a place anymore, it was a person. I had found mine in her. Her return wasn't marked by fireworks or grand gestures. There were no suitcases flung open in haste, no emotional declarations in the doorway. It was quieter than that, gentler. She walked through her front door like she'd never left, and in a way, maybe she hadn't. Her scent lavender, citrus, a trace of something woodsy blended with the home like it belonged there, like her. Presence had always been the missing note in a song that had kept playing on loop. She placed her bag by the couch, kicked off her shoes, and sighed as she stood in the middle of her living room. As if exhaling weeks of restrained longing, I didn't crowd her. I didn't try to make it anything more than what it was. I watched her quietly from the kitchen where I had just finished steeping 2 mugs of tea, and she met my gaze with the kind of smile that didn't rise fast or fall quickly. And in that smile, I read everything: relief, gratitude, affection, and above all, choice. She had chosen to come back not because she had to, but because she wanted to. We sat on the couch, our mugs warming our hands but not needing words. The TV was off. The silence wasn't filled with anything except the comfort of shared space Eventually, she reached for my hand, fingers curling around mine like it was instinct. Like tease. This simplicity was exactly what her heart had craved in all those gallery halls and curated exhibits. And I understood then what had really brought her back. It wasn't that the job wasn't fulfilling. It was that fulfillment, real and lasting, had taken on a new shape for her. A shape that included me. Later that evening, she unpacked slowly, deliberately. Not because she was tired, but because it was a ritual folding herself back into her space, one garment, one item, one memory at a time. I helped her hang the few dresses she had taken, placed her slippers back by the edge of the bed, and refilled the glass jar where she kept her tea bags. These small actions felt oddly sacred, as though I was helping reassemble a version of her that had been out in the world searching and now had returned, ready to stay. We cooked dinner together, roasted vegetables, lemon herb chicken, and rice. With pine nuts and parsley, she moved around the kitchen with fluid grace, humming as she stirred the pan, occasionally glancing up at me with that familiar sparkle that had once caught me off guard and now felt like home. We ate on the back porch, wrapped in a blanket, as the cool evening settled in. A few stars had begun to emerge, and she pointed out a constellation I didn't recognize, tracing it with her finger like it was her own personal story etched into the sky. That night, as we curled into bed, she whispered, almost to herself, "It's strange. How natural this feels." I pulled her closer. That's the best kind of strange. The following week brought with it a surprising shift. Not dramatic, not disruptive, just real. Living together, even in its informal way, meant discovering the edges of someone's habits. She liked to hum when she cleaned. I preferred silence. She folded towels in thirds. I didn't fold them at all. She read before bed, sometimes until midnight. I conked out before the first page. None of it was tension. If anything, it was proof that we weren't imagining this bond. We were testing it against reality and finding it held up one morning. I came into the kitchen to find her poring over old sketchbooks, charcoal portraits, watercolor experiments, even collages art she hadn't touched in years. She looked up, a bit sheepish. "I used to love this. Then life got in the way." "And let life get out of the way again," I said. "Start again. Use the guest room as a studio." She blinked, surprised by the simplicity of my suggestion. "Really?" "Yes. You made space for me in your world. Let me make space for you in mine." That afternoon, I helped her move furniture, roll out a rug, clean old brushes. The guest room transformed slowly into a haven of creative freedom. She'd sit for hours, windows open, jazz humming low in the background, her hands stained with ink and acrylics. She glowed in those moments like someone who was rediscovering the person she used to be before expectations shaped her into something else. One evening, while she was painting, she looked up and said, "You know what I like most about us?" I turned from the doorway. "What?" "We're not pretending. Not rushing. Not filling space just to avoid silence. We're letting it grow at its own pace." I walked over and gently kissed her on the forehead, 'cause it's real. But even real things can be tested, and ours was gently, but undeniably, when her son Ethan came to visit. I'd heard about him, of course. 32, divorced, lived 2 states over. He and Evelyn were close, but not always emotionally in sync. She had mentioned their relationship was sometimes strained, not because of lack of love, but because he saw her more as mom than as a woman who had her own chapters, her own life. He arrived on a Friday afternoon, tall and quiet, polite but cautious. I greeted him with warmth, trying not to overstep. He nodded, shook my hand, and looked at Evelyn in a way that clearly said, "We'll talk later." That evening was polite but tense. Conversations skated over safe topics, whether travel, work. Evelyn was composed, gracious, but I could feel her energy shifting, retreating. After Ethan went to bed, she sat beside me in the kitchen, her hands wrapped tightly around a mug of tea. "I should have told him more about you," she said softly. "But I didn't know how. I didn't want him to think I was rushing into something." "You're not rushing," I said. "You're living." She nodded, but I could see the worry in her eyes. The next day I gave them space. I took a long walk, ran errands, let them talk. When I returned, the air felt different, calmer. Ethan looked at me with less suspicion. That night, over dinner, he asked me questions, not interrogations, but real ones. About my work, my family, what I loved about his mom. I answered honestly, and when I said, she makes space for people like no one I've ever known, he looked down and nodded slowly, as if realizing something he hadn't wanted to admit. Before he left, Ethan pulled me aside. She's happy. I can see that. That's all I needed to know. After he drove off, Evelyn hugged me tighter than she ever had before. You handled that better than I could have imagined. We're not just building something for us, I told her. Building something that holds up in the light. And that's what we kept doing, day by day. No rush, no scripts. Just love that lived in the real, imperfect. Beautiful spaces between us. It's strange how quickly something new becomes familiar. How quickly the separate lives begin weaving into one another until the seams become invisible. Evelyn and I hadn't declared anything official. There were no labels or ultimatums. But what we had was undeniable and steady. The days had fallen into a rhythm that neither of us had designed, but both of us embraced. Mornings began with the clinking of mugs, tea for her and coffee for me. The quiet murmur of NPR playing in the background, and the occasional chirp of birds gathering on the fence just outside the kitchen window. We would read the news in silence, occasionally sharing a headline or a joke, and mostly just being comfortably present in the same space, our breaths in sync like a silent dance. Evelyn had blossomed in her art studio. What had once been a storage room was now filled with vibrant chaos canvases propped against the walls. Open jars of paint, scattered pencils and brushes, sketches pinned up like puzzle pieces. There was life in that room. Some days she barely emerged from it, lost in her work, smudged with color and glowing in a way that no gallery ever managed to coax out of her. I found myself drawn to her in those moments, not just because of how she looked, but because of how she moved through her passion with such unapologetic focus. Watching her work was like watching someone pray, not with words, but with their whole body. My own work slowed during those weeks. Not because there wasn't enough of it, but because I had stopped seeking it so aggressively. I took on only what I could handle, jobs close to the neighborhood, nothing that required more than a few hours at a time. Wanted to be close in case she needed me, but a bigger part was something I hadn't quite admitted to myself yet. I liked being available to her, not just physically, but emotionally. I liked knowing I could run to the store if she forgot paint thinner, or that I could be there to taste test the new stew she was experimenting with. It felt less like obligation and more like alignment. We weren't without differences, though. Evelyn liked planning. It was more impulsive. She found comfort in routine, in grocery lists and meal preps, and penciled-in walks. I thrived in flexibility, in letting the day tell me what it wanted to be. There were small moments when those differences created friction, a forgotten appointment, a missed call, an unspoken expectation, but we never let them harden into resentment. Instead, we met each disagreement with curiosity. Not, why are you like this? But help me understand. In those conversations, I realized that love wasn't about sameness. It was about holding space for difference without fear. One morning, while I was trimming the hedges in her front yard, Evelyn called me inside with a strange tone in her voice, excited, a bit breathless. I stepped into the kitchen and saw a white envelope in her hand. She was smiling, but her fingers trembled. "It's from the gallery," she said, holding it out. I wiped my hands on a towel and took the envelope, opening it slowly. Inside was a letter and invitation to showcase her work in a major exhibit 2 months from now. A full solo feature. The kind artists wait years for. I looked up at her, stunned, and she laughed through tears. "They want me," she said, like she couldn't quite believe it. "They always should have," I replied, pulling her into a hug. That night, we celebrated. She opened a bottle of wine she'd been saving for years, something rich and dark, with notes of blackberry and vanilla, and we sat on the back porch, watching the sky fade into indigo. She talked about the pieces she wanted to include, the themes she'd explore, how nervous she felt about being seen so publicly again. And I listened, really listened, not just to her words, but to her fear and her pride and her hope. I knew how much this meant to her. I also knew that this opportunity would demand more from her time, energy, space. And I was okay with that. But something changed after that. Not between us, but around us. The calls from the gallery increased. Emails piled up. There were meetings, planning sessions, interviews. She started spending longer hours in her studio, often staying up late into the night. I supported her completely, but I began to feel like a shadow in our own house, present but fading. Its meals became quicker, conversations shorter. She wasn't distant in her affection, but she was occupied, and I couldn't blame her. She had waited so long for this, sacrificed so much. I just hadn't anticipated how quickly our shared world would begin to feel like hers alone again. One evening, I brought it up not with resentment, but with vulnerability. "I miss you," I said simply, as we sat in the living room, her laptop open on her lap and paint still drying on her forearms. She looked up, startled. "I'm sorry. I've just been trying to keep up with everything. This is a lot." "I know, and I'm proud of you," I said. "I just want to make sure we don't lose what we started building." She closed the laptop and set it aside. "You're right. I've been so focused on not messing this up, I forgot to bring you with me." That was Evelyn. She didn't deflect. She didn't rationalize. She met the moment with honesty. From that night on, we found small ways to stay connected. Morning walks before she dove into her studio. A shared playlist we built together that played quietly while she worked. Weekly dinner nights where the rule was no phones, no work talk, just us. These weren't grand gestures, but they were meaningful. And they reminded us both that love didn't have to fight for space. It just needed to be remembered. Then came the night before the gallery opening. She was anxious more than I'd ever seen her. She tried on 3 different outfits. She kept rehearsing her speech. She second-guessed her work. I sat with her through it all, holding her hand, reminding her that this wasn't about proving anything. It was about celebrating what she already was. Before we went to bed, she turned to me and said, "What if they don't get it? What if I don't belong there?" I kissed her forehead and whispered, "You don't need to belong. You already do." That night, as we lay in the quiet darkness, her hand resting on my chest, I realized something loving her didn't mean always being at the center of her world. It meant being the ground beneath her feet when she stepped into it, and I was okay being that ground for her. Always the morning of the gallery opening was soaked in nervous energy. Evelyn moved around the house with a kind of distracted intensity, checking her bag repeatedly to make sure she had everything her artist's statement. The exhibit layout notes, even an extra pair of shoes just in case. I stayed out of her way for the most part, making coffee, ironing her blouse,
Us.
quietly tending to all the invisible things she wouldn't think about until she had to. I watched her from the doorway for a moment, her back to me as she carefully slipped the final print into her portfolio, her shoulders rising and falling with a deep breath that didn't seem to calm her. It struck me how much weight she carried, not just the pressure to succeed, but the pressure to justify the space she was finally taking up in the world again. It wasn't lost on me that for so long, Evelyn had learned to fold herself smaller for the comfort of others. Today, she was stepping out fully, and the world would have no choice but to take notice. We drove to the city in relative quiet, the radio playing soft instrumentals while she stared out the window, occasionally tapping her fingers against her leg. I knew her well enough to know this was her way of anchoring herself before the storm. She wasn't nervous about the crowd, not really. She was nervous about being seen, truly seen, the vulnerability of putting her heart on canvas and standing. In front of it, as strangers assessed, it was no small thing. The gallery was bustling when we arrived. Staff members moved quickly with clipboards and radios, adjusting lighting and finalizing placements. Evelyn's name was printed on a large banner just above the entrance. Rediscovered Light, an exhibition by Evelyn Warren. She stood still for a long moment, staring up at it like she wasn't sure it was really there. I gently touched, her arm and whispered that she'd earned every letter of that sign. She gave me a small, grateful smile and walked in. The exhibit was beautiful. 24 pieces arranged in deliberate flow, telling a story not just of color and composition, but of evolution. Her evolution. Her early pieces were softer, introspective, like whispers from a quieter time. As the exhibit progressed, the work grew bolder, more experimental. There were sharp lines, vivid palettes, and beneath all of it, a pulsar voice. Unfiltered and unapologetic. Guests began to trickle in, curious at first, then captivated. They leaned in close, studying textures, reading her captions, murmuring words like brave and intimate. Evelyn at first hovered by the edges. She didn't insert herself. She watched people watching her work. It wasn't until someone asked her about a particular painting, a stark, abstract rendering of a woman standing alone in a doorway, that she stepped forward and spoke. Her voice was calm but sure. She explained the meaning behind it, the feeling of standing on the edge of something new, of not knowing whether to step forward or back. The person nodded, moved, and just like that, she became part of the room, stood back, letting her have her moment. People approached her with questions, with compliments. A local arts journalist asked for an interview. A gallery owner from a nearby city expressed interest in showcasing her next season. And Evelyn? She didn't shrink. She didn't downplay herself. She stood tall, her eyes shining, and I couldn't have been prouder. As the crowd swelled and the buzz grew louder, I slipped outside for a breath of air. I needed a moment, not because I was overwhelmed, but because I wanted to take in what this day meant, not just for her, but for us. We had started as two strangers in a house with a broken faucet, and now she was a woman reborn, and I was. Standing just outside the glow of it, knowing I had helped her find her way back to herself. When I returned inside, I saw her standing with a woman I didn't recognize, tall, stylish, with short silver hair and an assertive presence. They were laughing, and Evelyn introduced her to me as Miriam, an old college friend and fellow artist. Miriam was full of energy and praise, saying how proud she was of Evelyn and how long she'd waited for her to return to the world. I stepped aside as they caught up, but I noticed something as they talked to lightness in Evelyn's face I hadn't seen before. It wasn't about the gallery. It wasn't about the success. It was about belonging. Later that night, when we were finally home, she kicked off her shoes, sank onto the couch, and looked at me with an expression that was part disbelief, part joy. "I didn't think I could still do that," she said softly. "You didn't just do it, you soared." She looked down at her hands, still faintly speckled with ink. "I've spent so long being everything for everyone else. I forgot what it felt like to be just me." I took her hand in mine. "Well, I never met the everyone else version, but the you I've come to know. She's remarkable." There was a silence then, full of warmth and meaning. We had climbed a hill together, and from this vantage point, everything looked clearer. She leaned into me, and I wrapped my arm around her, and in that quiet embrace, I understood something simple. And true, we weren't just falling in love. We were building a life. A few days later, as the gallery's success continued to ripple through calls and emails, Evelyn asked if I'd be willing to take a small trip with her a weekend away to the mountains. A retreat, she said, to breathe. Again, I agreed instantly. We packed light and drove north, winding through thick forests and quiet roads until we reached a small cabin she had reserved. It was rustic, but cozy, with creaky floors and a stone fireplace. There was no internet, no cell service. It's just us. Those 2 days were a kind of reset. We cooked simple meals, took long walks through trails carpeted in fallen leaves, and sat by the fire at night, talking about everything and nothing. One afternoon, as we sat near a creek, she turned to me and asked quietly, "Did you ever think that something like this would come from fixing a leaky faucet?" I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was absurdly true. Not even a little. She reached out and touched my face, her thumb grazing my cheek. "It's like life snuck up on us." "Maybe it didn't sneak," I said. "Maybe we were just finally still enough to let it catch up." She didn't respond with words. She leaned in and kissed me. It's not like before. not hesitant, not unsure. It was deep and certain, full of the things we hadn't yet said, but had both begun to understand. That night, as we lay in bed listening to the wind outside, she whispered, I'm not afraid of being older. I'm afraid of wasting time. I squeezed her hand beneath the blanket. Then let's not waste any of it. And we didn't weed. Return from the mountains changed not in a dramatic, visible sense, but in the quiet ways that matter most. Something had settled between us during that trip, something unspoken but certain. Evelyn was no longer looking backward, mourning the years she thought she'd lost. She was finally standing in her present, and for the first time in a long while, she wasn't alone there. I saw it in the way she moved through her home, now with confidence, with calm, with joy. Her days weren't driven by pressure anymore. They were shaped by intention. She made time for her art, yes, but she also made time for small pleasures. Fresh bread from the market, long phone calls with her sister, early morning walks around the block just to hear the birds. And she made time for us quiet evenings curled up on the couch, spontaneous trips to the lake, weekend brunches on the patio. Our lives had started to entwine in ways we hadn't planned but completely welcomed. One late afternoon, as the sun spilled gold across her studio floor, Evelyn emerged from her art room holding a canvas unlike anything I'd seen from her before. It was a portrait, but not a literal one. It was abstract, swirling with deep greens, earthy browns, and a vivid streak of red slicing through the center. She set it down with care and looked at me, her expression unreadable. "This is us," she said quietly. I stepped closer, taking in the motion, the tension, the layers buried beneath the colors. "It's strong," I said. "It's unfinished," she replied, "but so are we." That hit me harder than I expected. In all my years of working in people's homes, I'd grown used to the temporary repairs that solved a problem, fixed a leak, patched a crack. But with Evelyn, this wasn't about fixing. It was about building, layer by layer, mistake by mistake. And it didn't need to be perfect. It just needed to be real. Her next gallery piece was based on that painting. It didn't become the most popular one, but it became her favorite. She titled it Becoming. I asked her once if that title was about her or about us. She smiled and said yes. Meanwhile, life, as it always does, brought in unexpected guests. One morning, while I was working on a neighbor's garage door, I got a call from my brother Sam. He was in town, passing through on business, and wanted to meet for dinner. I hadn't seen him in over a year, and while we were close as kids, time and distance had wedged themselves between us. I told him I'd love to catch up and invited him over to Evelyn's for dinner the next night. When I told her, she didn't hesitate. "Of course, I'll cook," and she did. She prepared a meal that tasted like warmth and welcome limen, thyme chicken. Roasted carrots with honey glaze, and her signature sourdough that she insisted wasn't perfect, even though I had watched her perfect it months ago. Sam arrived with a bottle of wine and a cautious curiosity. I introduced him, and Evelyn, with that rare grace of hers, made him feel at ease within minutes. As dinner unfolded, I watched their conversation move from polite to personal. Sam asked about her art, and she shared her journey. She asked about his work, and he admitted he wasn't as fulfilled as he once was. They spoke like old friends by the end of the meal, and later that night, as I walked Sam to his car, stopped and turned to me. "She's special," he said simply. "Yeah," I replied. "She is." He looked at me with something close to admiration. "You seem different, in a good way." I didn't have to think about my answer. I am. Over the following weeks, Evelyn's second exhibit came together. This one was more experimental, full of layered textures and deeper themes. It explored time, healing, self-rediscovery. It wasn't just art. It was a map of the internal world. She had spent years navigating. I had been there for most of that journey. She invited me to her private showing, where critics and collectors roamed quietly through the gallery space. I stayed to the side, watching her shine again, and this time, I didn't feel like I was in the shadows. I felt like I was part of the light. That night, back at the house, she handed me a small box. Inside was a key sleek silver, attached to a leather tag with my initials burned into it. "I know you already have the other one," she said, referring to the spare I'd used for months, "but I wanted this to be official. I want you here, not just for now, for whatever comes." I didn't need time to consider. I told her yes with my whole chest. Living together full-time didn't feel like a big shift. It felt natural. We split chores without charting them. We respected each other's silences. We learned each other's off days and moods and rhythms. We made each other better, not by fixing, but by simply showing up. I found myself doing things I never expected, taking interest in art books, learning to cook beyond eggs and toast, helping her organize her studio with labeled bins and color-coded racks. She, in turn, asked about my work, rode along on supply. Runs, even helped restain an old deck one weekend just for the experience. We laughed a lot during that project. Her hands were covered in specks of varnish, and at one point she got a splinter and tried to pretend she hadn't. I caught her wincing and took her hand, gently removing it. She looked at me and whispered, "How did I go so long without this?" "This?" I asked, being seen. She said, I didn't have an answer, but I held her hand a little tighter. As we moved into winter, the holidays approached. She suggested we host a small gathering, just close friends, some neighbors, maybe her sister, and Ethan if they could come. I agreed, and we began preparing. It was the first time I'd ever truly hosted anything, and Evelyn made it joyful. We hung string lights on the porch, put candles in the windows, baked pies in advance. We even made small handmade ornaments as party favors. She said it was a tradition she had once dreamed of starting, but never had the chance to. That night, as friends filled our home with warmth and laughter, I saw her drifting through the room like she belonged in every corner of it, and I realized I wasn't just witnessing a woman bloom, I was blooming too, right alongside her. Later, as we cleaned up, she looked at me across the kitchen. Her hair messy, sleeves rolled, flower still on her cheek. "You've made this house feel like something new," she said. "No," I replied, walking toward her. "You made it possible for it to become something new." We kissed under the archway of the kitchen, soft and slow, as snow began to fall outside. Neither of us said it. We both knew what we were really saying. We had built something steady, imperfect, lasting. Winter deepened around us in quiet. Muffled layers. The world outside slowed with the cold, frosted windshields in the morning, boots lined by the door, and breath rising in puffs during walks through the neighborhood. But inside the house, things remained warm, alive. The furnace hummed gently through the night, candles flickered during dinners. And Evelyn always had something simmering on the stove soups, stews, mulled cider that filled the air with cloves and oranges. Her studio, once a place of frantic movement, now radiated a quieter purpose. She worked with less urgency and more presence, often pausing mid-brushstroke to lean back, observe, breathe. I had never seen her so settled, not just in a place but in herself. I found myself changing in ways I didn't fully understand. The handyman who once moved from job to job, never sticking around long enough to know his clients' last names, was now waking each morning beside the same woman in the same house and feeling more anchored than ever before. My tools sat quietly in the garage most days, not because I didn't have work, but because I chose carefully now. I took on projects that gave me room to breathe, to live. I wasn't chasing something undefined anymore. I had found it, and her name was Evelyn. One snowy morning, we stood by the window with mugs in hand, watching as the street disappeared beneath a thick white blanket. She rested her head against my shoulder and asked what I thought about taking a trip somewhere. "Warm. Just for a week," she said, "before my next exhibit starts pulling me back in." I smiled and said yes. Not because I needed the sun, but because I needed time with her undistracted. Free, we chose the coast, a quiet town where the waves curled gently onto the sand and the sun hung low and golden. We stayed in a small beachfront, inn with creaky floors and a balcony that faced the ocean. Mornings were slow, filled with long walks by the shore, shells gathered in coat pockets, and laughter shared over seaside breakfasts. At night, we'd lie beneath thick blankets, the window cracked just enough to let the sound of the waves lull us to sleep. One evening, just after sunset, we sat on the sand wrapped in one blanket, the sky melting into shades of lavender and peach. She turned to me, eyes glinting with a quiet seriousness. "There's something I've been thinking about," she said. I looked at her, heart steady. "What is it?" "I never planned for this part of my life," she said. "Not after everything. I thought love was behind me. The best parts of connection had already happened. And then you showed up. You, fixing a faucet, looking like you belonged in every corner of my home. And now you do. And it terrifies me a little." I didn't speak. I let her finish. "I'm not afraid of you," she continued. "I'm afraid of how much I need this. How much I need us." I reached for her hand, wrapping her cold fingers in mine. "I felt that same fear," I said. "I wasn't supposed to stay anywhere too long. Wasn't supposed to let someone in again. But here I am. I don't." "Want to be anywhere else?" She smiled then, and it wasn't sad or hesitant. It was full, soft, certain. The kind of smile you give when you know you're exactly where you're meant to be. We returned home to a quiet house, snow still blanketing the yard. The neighbors waved from across driveways, and Evelyn spent her first few days painting sketches. Of the ocean from memory, her palette shifted more blues, more soft whites, like the sea had left its fingerprint on her soul. I noticed it in her cooking, too. Lighter dishes, hints of citrus, new spices. It was as if the trip had opened up another part of her, and I was grateful to be witness to its unfolding. Then came the letter. It arrived one Thursday morning, a sled, among junk mail and a catalog. The return address was from a prestigious art foundation in New York. Evelyn opened it slowly at the kitchen table, her brow furrowing as she read. When she looked up, I could already tell the contents had weight. "They're offering me a residency," she said quietly. 3 months in the Hudson Valley, all expenses paid. Studio space, connections to curators. I sat down across from her, heart tightening, not with jealousy or fear, but with the sting of change. "That's amazing," I said. She nodded, though her eyes were distant. "It is, it really is. You'd have to go alone," I finished. Down, hands folded in her lap. "They don't allow guests. It's intensive, isolated. They want artists to go deep." We sat in silence for a moment, the kind that isn't filled with tension, but consideration. I could already see the conflict in her excitement fighting. Against guilt, curiosity weighed down by attachment. "I want you to go," I said finally. "You've earned this, and I'll be right here when you get back." Her eyes shimmered. "You really mean that?" "I do," I said. "You've spent your life giving to others. This is something just for you. You should take it." But just like that, the next chapter began to take shape. We spent the following weeks preparing. She sorted supplies, ordered canvases, researched the region. I helped where I could, setting up her travel logistics, making sure she had what she needed. And every night, as we curled into each other beneath the same blanket, we didn't talk about the distance that was coming. We talked about the present. We soaked in every minute of it like we were bottling time. On the morning she left, we stood in the kitchen once more, sunlight cutting through the window in golden streaks. Her suitcase sat by the door, heavy with brushes and sweaters and all the courage she'd gathered over the years. I walked her to the car, kissed her forehead, and whispered, "Go make magic." She smiled through tears. "All right." Every day. And she did. Letters arrived like clockwork, pages filled with sketches. Thoughts, half-poems, snippets of conversations overheard at the residency. I replied with updates from home, how the snow was finally melting, how the cat next door had adopted our porch, how her studio felt too quiet without her music playing in it. We stayed connected through ink and paper, and somehow it made everything feel even more intentional. The days moved slowly, but they moved. I missed her laughter, her tea rituals, the way she'd hum when concentrating. But I also found something unexpected, space for my own growth. I started drawing again, something I hadn't done since I was a teenager. I took on a community project restoring the town's old gazebo. I began writing in a journal, her absence. Wasn't a void, It was an invitation to deepen myself, too. Then one evening, a month before she was due back, I received a package. Inside was a small painting. Just colors, no form. Deep reds, warm golds, a streak of violet across the center. Beneath it, a note in her handwriting. This is what it feels like to miss someone and still feel full. I love you. And I realized then we weren't apart. Not really. We're still building, still becoming, even from different places. The countdown to Evelyn's return felt both like a tether pulling taut and a horizon forever stretching. I marked the days with quiet rituals, watering her plants at the exact time she used to. Dusting her studio, even though no dust dared settle on her sacred space. Rereading the letters she sent and letting her voice echo through my mind like a song I knew by heart. Every day, I'd walk past her studio and pause at the door, tempted to go inside but choosing not to. It wasn't reverence that held me back. It was respect. That space belonged to her spirit, and I wanted her to find it untouched, waiting for her exactly as she left it. On the outside, life carried on. The days lengthened as winter slipped into the slow stretch of spring. The ice melted from the roof. Crocuses poked through thawing soil, and neighbors began emerging from their homes like bears waking from hibernation. I took more walks, sometimes through the woods behind the neighborhood, sometimes to the old bookstore where Evelyn and I first had coffee. The clerk knew me now, always giving a small smile and nod when I entered. I'd pick up something she might like, a book on color theory, a novel about second chances, and save them for her return, despite the quiet ache of missing her. I found a rhythm that didn't feel lonely. It felt reflective. Started journaling every evening, something she had unknowingly inspired. My entries weren't grand or poetic. They were observations, thoughts, moments I wanted to hold. And through those pages I began to understand something that had only tugged at the edges of my awareness before. Loving someone doesn't mean filling every moment with them. It means allowing space for them to grow, even when that growth happens miles away. Then came the call. It was a Sunday morning. I'd just returned from the farmer's market, a ritual Evelyn and I had always enjoyed. My phone rang, and her name appeared on the screen. I answered with a smile already forming, expecting the usual warmth in her voice. But something was different this time. There was an edge to it, a breathlessness. They want me to extend, she said. Another 3 months. The words hit like a pebble tossed into still waters, small but rippling. Oh, I said, trying to catch up. It's a mentorship. One-on-one with a curator from the Whitney. She saw my work and thinks I could go even deeper. She believes in me, Roman, and I did too. Of course I did, that's incredible, I managed. She paused and I heard her swallow. On the other end? But it means more time apart. I didn't want to decide without talking to you. I sat down on the edge of the couch, staring at the sunlight pooling on the floor. You should do it, I said slowly. If it feels right, it does, she said, voice quiet. But it also feels terrifying, like I'm choosing between something I want and someone I love. I shook my head even though she couldn't see it. You're not choosing, you're expanding. If this is part of your path, I'll walk the stretch from here. There was silence. Then softly, you amaze me, Roman. We ended the call gently with love in our voices, but distance in our breath. I sat there for a while, the room humming around me. I wasn't upset, not exactly, but I did feel something shift. The kind of shift that happens, not when something breaks, but when it stretches beyond its original form in the days that followed. I adjusted. Again, I reminded myself of everything I had learned over the past few months about patience, about space, about how love sometimes means letting go just enough to let the other person fly. Evelyn's letters came less frequently now, not because she loved me less, but because her days were fuller. The few she did send were dense with ideas, with breakthroughs, with moments that thrilled her. I read them like sacred texts, proud of her, even when I missed her voice over morning coffee. And then, just as spring tipped into early summer, something changed again. I was walking past her studio when I stopped, drawn by a sudden urge. I opened the door and stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of her oils and cedarwood candles. Light poured in through the skylight, dancing across blank canvases stacked neatly against the far wall, and there in the corner was a small box I hadn't noticed before. Inside were old sketches, early drafts, color swatches, notes in the margins. I sat on the stool and sifted through them, each one a piece of her journey, a breadcrumb trail. Of who she had been and who she was becoming, one sketch caught my eye. It was of two figures standing on opposite sides of a river. Arms outstretched, a bridge barely forming between them, half-built, raw, and uneven. Beneath it, she had written in pencil, "Love is not meeting in the middle. It's building toward each other, even if one side gets there first." I felt a lump form in my throat. Later that evening, I wrote her a letter, long, handwritten, carefully worded. I told her I was proud, that I missed her, that I had been changed by her in ways I was only beginning to understand. I included a photo of the sketch, telling her it had reminded me of us. I didn't ask for anything. I didn't pressure her. I simply sent it with all the love I had, letting it carry what words could not. Weeks passed, then one night I came home from a job to find the porch light on and soft music drifting from the house. At first I thought I'd left the radio on. But as I stepped inside, I froze. Evelyn was there, standing in the kitchen. Hair pulled back, apron dusted with flour, candles lit on the table. She turned, and for a moment we just stared at each other. The air too full for words. "I couldn't do it," she said finally. "Not without you." I walked to her slowly, almost unsure if I was dreaming. But the mentorship. "I realized something," she said. "Every time I pushed forward, I thought I was proving I could be whole on my own, and I am. That doesn't mean I want to be. Not without you beside me. I want both. The art, the love, the life we've built. I don't want to keep postponing that life for someday. I want it now." I reached for her hand, anchoring myself in its warmth. "Are you sure?" She nodded, tears in her eyes. "You gave me space to fly. Now I'm choosing where I land." And just like that, she was home. That night, we sat beneath. The same blanket, music low, the future wide open, but no longer far off. We talked about how to build a life that held room for both our dreams. We talked about shared studio space, seasonal trips, maybe even a second exhibit together, her paintings. My journal entries side by side. We didn't have it all figured out, but we had each other. And for the first time, that was enough. Summer arrived in full bloom, as if nature itself wanted to celebrate Evelyn's return. The trees wore their richest green, the air smelled like ripe fruit and cut grass, and the days stretched wide and golden. Just in the weather, but in the way we moved through our lives together. Her bags from New York remained unpacked for weeks, not because she was avoiding them, but because she was choosing to be present instead. The past months apart hadn't created distance. They had deepened something far more profound: our appreciation. For the ordinary, we fell into new rituals, some familiar, some forged from scratch. Sunday mornings became our sacred times, low breakfasts on the patio. Barefoot walks in the garden, quiet reading hours stretched across the afternoon. Evelyn transformed the spare room into a collaborative space where we could both create her. With her brushes and canvases, me with my journals, sketches, and the woodworking projects I'd picked back up. It felt like we had carved out a tiny universe inside our home, one built not just on love, but on mutual expansion. One afternoon, while rearranging the living room to make space for a new bookshelf she'd found at a vintage market, Evelyn turned to me and said something I'd been quietly wondering myself. "Do you ever think about what this could look like?" Long term, I set down the lamp I was holding and met her gaze. There was no fear in her voice, only curiosity. I nodded. "I think about it all the time." Her eyes softened, her fingers brushing mine. "Don't need anything fancy," she said. "No ring, no vows, just shared mornings. Years of them. Then let's build them," I said. And we did. We didn't rush into legalities or ceremonies. Instead, we began to live with even more intention. We co-authored a list of shared goals, everything from growing our own vegetables to eventually spending a year living abroad. We created a shared calendar not out of necessity, but to block out time for what we called does days. No work, no distractions, just time together. We opened a joint savings account not for a wedding or a honeymoon, but for a greenhouse. Evelyn had always dreamed of building. That fall, we hosted an open house for the neighborhood. It was Evelyn's idea's celebration not just of art, but of community. She displayed her newest pieces throughout the house, transforming each room into its own little gallery. I set up a corner of the porch with handmade woodwork, a bench, some frames, and a few wooden birds I'd carved during the quiet months she was away. We baked together the night before lavender cookies, rosemary bread, a massive pitcher of homemade lemonade, and by noon, the place buzzed with warmth and conversation. People came not just to see the work, but to see us, to witness what had grown quietly over the past year into something quietly magnificent. There were compliments, of course, but the one that stayed with me came from our neighbor, Mrs. Beckett, who lingered by the dessert table with a warm cup of cider in her hand. "You two," she said, "make each other more yourselves." I carried that sentence with me for weeks. Late that October, Evelyn surprised me with something I hadn't expected, a gallery invitation addressed to both of us. The same curator who had offered her the extended mentorship in New York had been following her new work hand. To our astonishment, had taken interest in my journal entries and wood sculptures too. "They want to showcase us," Evelyn said, blinking at the email like it might change if she stared long enough. "A joint exhibit. Love in process, they're calling it." At first I hesitated. I'd never thought of myself as an artist. A craftsman, sure. It's a man who could fix a broken pipe or restore an old porch swing, but an artist. It felt foreign. But Evelyn took my hand, looked me dead in the eyes, and said, "Your story is art, Roman. Your hands, your words, you've been building things your whole life. This is no different." So, we said yes. The next few months passed in a kind of creative blur. I spent long nights in the garage workshop designing a new series of wooden sculptures that captured the four. It's evolution of our connection from separate shapes that slowly bent toward each other. Two pieces that locked together not because they were identical, but because they had been carved to understand the other. Evelyn painted late into the night, canvases leaning against every available surface. Her new collection was unlike anything she had done before, less about past pain, more about future hope. We worked side by side, music playing softly in the background, sometimes talking, sometimes just breathing in the same room. The exhibit, held in a sun-drenched warehouse turned art space downtown, was small but electric. Visitors wandered from my wood sculptures to her paintings and back again, the threads of our story woven visibly through each piece. Near the center of the gallery, we installed a shared installation, a bench I'd built from reclaimed wood, surrounded by Evelyn's canvas panels. It invited people to sit, to pause, to reflect. We named it Still Becoming. After the opening, we stood outside under string lights, hands wrapped around paper cups of cider, the quiet hum of the city behind us. Evelyn leaned against me and whispered, "I didn't know life could feel like this. Neither did I, but I never wanted it to end." That winter, I finally built the greenhouse. It sat at the back of the property, framed in cedar with wide windows that caught every ounce of sunlight. It wasn't just for plants. It became a sanctuary, our thinking space, our slow coffee nook, our rainy day retreat. Inside, we placed a bench made from the same wood as the one in the exhibit and hung one of Evelyn's smaller paintings above. We started growing herbs, then tomatoes, then things we didn't even know the names of. It wasn't about the harvest. It was about tending to something together, watching it change slowly over time, just like us. One morning, snow gently fell around the glass. Evelyn handed me a folded piece of paper. It was a sketch to older figures sitting in the greenhouse. Backs turned, surrounded by wild vines and golden light. She had written beneath it, "Future us. Still here?" The months that followed felt like the heart of something we'd unknowingly been building toward since the day I first knocked on her door with a wrench in one hand and an open afternoon in the other. Life settled into a rhythm that felt earned quiet. but alive, layered with routines that were anything but ordinary. Evelyn and I didn't chase big moments anymore. Instead, we celebrated the subtler victories, a new bloom in the greenhouse. The way her soup always tasted better on rainy nights, how her head naturally found its place on my shoulder during evening walks. Our world had grown small in the best way, not limited but focused. We hosted a small dinner once a month, just a few friends and neighbors around the table. These gatherings had become a cherished tradition, candles flickering, jazz humming low, plates passed hand to hand, while laughter rose and fell like a tide. Evelyn thrived in these moments. Her face would light up as she told stories from her art residency or listened intently to someone describe the way a recent loss had reshaped their view of love. I often found myself watching her more than I participated, still caught off guard sometimes by how beautiful she looked in the simple glow of everyday life. One evening after a dinner, as we cleaned the kitchen, Evelyn turned to me and asked, a question I hadn't expected but had somehow been waiting to hear. Do you ever regret not having had children? The question lingered, not like a wound but like a whisper from a quieter room. I dried my hands and leaned against the counter, thinking carefully. I think I used to, I said. It's not because I felt incomplete, but because I wondered if I missed something important, some legacy, some deeper love. She nodded, her gaze steady, but then I continued. I met you, and I realized love doesn't need to look like anyone else's to be real. What we have, it's not a substitute for anything. It's its own kind of legacy. She smiled then, the kind that didn't reach the lips right away, but began in the eyes. I used to feel that too. Like my story would end quietly in a studio somewhere, alone, and maybe it still would have been a good story, but now, now it feels shared. It echoes further. That winter, we began to teach. It wasn't something we'd planned. But after the success of our joint exhibit, a local arts nonprofit approached us about leading a series of workshops, Evelyn, in painting and form, and me in storytelling and woodworking. We hesitated at first. Teaching meant schedules, responsibilities, faces looking to us for guidance. But in the end, it felt right. Like an extension of the life we were building. Every Tuesday and Thursday evening, our quiet greenhouse life intersected with the bustling energy of curious minds. We opened up our shared studio, converted the garage into a makeshift workshop, and slowly became mentors. There was a young woman who painted grief with the softness of spring petals. It's an older man who hadn't picked up a brush since his wife passed away and now came. Every week, with tears in his eyes and color on his hands, I taught teenagers how to shape wood into something lasting, how to let their frustration fuel their creativity rather than break it. In those evenings, surrounded by nervous beginners and blooming confidence, I watched Evelyn shine in a new way. Not just as an artist, but as a guide, a gentle lighthouse. She didn't just teach painting, she taught how to look at the world with kinder eyes. One afternoon after class, as we locked up the studio, she turned to me and said, "This isn't something I ever thought I'd want. But now I can't imagine not doing it." And neither could I. Spring returned like an old friend, coaxing color back into the trees and laughter back into our porch. The greenhouse exploded in green herbs, climbing up makeshift trellises, tomatoes threatening to take over an entire corner. We started drying lavender to hang in the kitchen, pressing basil into olive oil, freezing mint into ice cubes for summer lemonade. Our life, once made up of chapters of loneliness and hesitation, now read like a garden catalog full of flavor, full of bloom. One evening, as golden hour painted everything in soft pinks and oranges, Evelyn handed me a worn notebook. "I've been writing," she said, almost shyly. "Little pieces, reflections, inspired by your journals." I opened it and read the first page. It was about the first day we met, her version of it. The details she remembered, the way my boots left wet prints on her hardwood floor. The way I frowned at the faucet like it had insulted me personally. The way I'd smiled when she offered me tea without asking. She had captured things I didn't know she'd noticed. Or maybe I hadn't let myself believe she did. "I want to make a book," she said. "Your words, my sketches. A story of how we built something, unexpectedly. I nodded slowly, overcome. With the quiet gravity of the idea, let's do it. And we did. The project took months. It wasn't rushed. We let it take its own shape, just like everything else in our life. We titled it Leaky Faucet, Full Heart. It was half memoir. It's half fart book, a hybrid of journal entries, visual stories, sketches from our old notebooks, and new reflections we wrote together. When it was done, we printed a small batch and handed them out during our next workshop. It wasn't about profit. It was about preservation, about saying this happened, existed like this, we loved like this. The response surprised us. People wrote to say it reminded them of lost love, of what they still hoped to find, of what they were learning to nurture again. One woman wrote, "Thank you for showing me that love at 50-something doesn't look like settling. It looks like beginning." Sometimes we'd sit on the back porch, Evelyn curled into my side, our book resting between us, and I'd think back to that first day, the faulty faucet, the unexpected question, the woman who opened a door and unknowingly changed the course of my life with 6 simple words. Would you consider an older woman? If I could go back and speak to that version of myself, the man with a wrench in his hand and no idea what was waiting on the other side of that job, wouldn't offer warnings or advice. I'd just smile and say, "You're about to meet someone who makes you believe again." And that would be enough. Time passed, not in leaps or bounds, but in small, quiet increments like morning dew that evaporates slowly, or the fading scent of coffee after the cup is empty. Evelyn and I didn't count anniversaries the way younger couples might. Instead, we marked time by seasons, by the return of familiar flowers, the completion of another art class, the way the light filtered differently through the kitchen in July compared to November. Life didn't need to be dramatic anymore. We'd had our share of defining moments. What mattered now were the gentle ones, the slow burn of trust, the way our habits shaped themselves around each other. Not out of necessity, but out of joy. The greenhouse had become a refuge not just for us, but for others too. People from our workshops would often stay a little longer, sip tea under the vines, and open up about things they hadn't said out loud in years. There was something disarming about that space, its warmth, its simplicity. Evelyn once said, "It was because the plants didn't care who you used to be. They only responded to how you treated them now." I realized over time that people were no different. In late summer, we took a road trip, not for any grand purpose, but simply because the map had started calling again. We packed the car with minimal supplies, sketchbooks, journals, a camera, some camping gear, and headed west with no specific destination. We stopped in small towns, ate at diners where the menus hadn't changed since 1972, stayed in motels with creaky floors and wallpaper that looked like memories. At night, we'd sit under starlit skies with no need to speak. The silence between us had become its own kind of language. Somewhere in Arizona, we found ourselves at a natural hot spring tucked behind an old service road. No signs, no entrance. Fees, just a warm pool of water cradled by rocks and tall grass. Evelyn waded in first, her laughter echoing as the heat rose around her. I joined her, and for a while, we floated, 2 quiet souls held by something ancient. She leaned her head against my shoulder and said, "I used to think freedom meant being alone. But now I think it's being known completely and still being allowed to roam." That sentence stayed with me. It echoed every time I caught her in a moment of her own solitude, in the early mornings when she painted in the garden, in the way she hummed when organizing her brushes, in the small smile she wore when walking barefoot through the dew. Was still her own person, fiercely so. And yet, she let me orbit close enough to share her world. That was a gift I never took for granted. When we returned home, fall had started to creep in. The days grew shorter, the nights colder. We brought the plants in from the greenhouse, started using the fireplace again, and made a habit of slow-cooked meals and long books read aloud by firelight. We weren't chasing anything. We'd arrived. It was sometime in late October when I noticed something had shifted in Evelyn. Not in a dramatic way, just a new kind of stillness in her. She moved slower, spoke softer. One morning as I handed her coffee, she winced when she reached for it. I asked if she was okay. She brushed it off as stiffness. But over the next few weeks, I saw the winces become more frequent. She dropped a brush one afternoon and stared at it for a long time before picking it up. She laughed less during our walks. There was a weariness in her that I hadn't seen before. Eventually, I convinced her to see a doctor. The appointment was quiet. We waited in an over-sanitized room filled with the kind of sterile optimism that only hospitals can pretend to have. She squeezed my hand as the physician read results from a screen, his voice steady but distant. Our words like degeneration, nerve compression, and surgical consideration floated between us like feathers dipped in lead. It wasn't terminal, but it wasn't nothing. A condition that would slowly affect her mobility, her grip strength, her energy back in the car. She didn't cry. She just stared ahead and said, "So, I'll paint slower. It's all bad." And she did. But more than that, we adjusted. I began helping her mix her paints, carry canvases, massage her fingers after long hours. She still taught classes, though now with a stool nearby. She still sketched every morning, even if her lines had changed looser, more impressionistic. She refused to let it define her, and I refused to let her carry it alone. We talked more often now about time, not in a fearful way, but in a practical one. What did we still want to do? What mattered most? We started planning shorter trips, investing in comforts that would make daily life easier, softer bedding, ergonomic chairs, a better kitchen layout. Evelyn, ever the realist, refused to let the diagnosis dictate her spirit. "This," she said one night, "is just another season. We've been through plenty." She was right. Still, I found myself awake some nights, staring at the ceiling, my hand resting on hers as she slept. Beside me, I wasn't afraid of losing her, at least not yet. I did fear watching her passion be chipped away piece by piece, watching the light in her eyes dim because her hands could no longer shape what her heart imagined. But she never let that happen. Instead, she began dictating ideas to me. We'd sit for hours, her describing a painting she saw in her mind, me jotting down notes, making thumbnail sketches, mixing the first layers for her. It became a partnership in the truest sense. Not just romantic, not just domestic, but deeply creative. Our love expanded once again. It's making room for something neither of us had predicted: interdependence, without imbalance. And it wasn't all solemn. There were still the small joys. Evelyn discovering audiobooks, me attempting to cook one of her grandmother's impossible stews, the night we tried to put together an IKEA bookshelf and ended up using it as firewood. The mornings where her hands ached too much to draw, but she'd sit beside me and narrate a story from our past while I carved it into wood. We created together, even if it looked different now. Eventually, Evelyn came to terms with a new kind of legacy. "Maybe I won't be known for my last pieces," she said. "Maybe I'll be remembered for how I taught others to see." Students adored her. They stayed long after classes ended. They wrote her letters. Some even started their own workshops, citing her influence. She'd nod and say, "That's the real art." Our love didn't fade. It matured. It got quieter, yes, but it burned cleaner, deeper. Like a candle placed inside, a lantern protected, steady, illuminating more than just itself. Winter returned like a memory, soft and unhurried. Snow clung to the windowsills and blanketed the garden in white. Our greenhouse, once vibrant and teeming with green, stood quiet, but not lifeless, just resting, much like us. Evelyn's condition had stabilized, but we both knew her days of painting for hours were behind her. That didn't mean she had stopped creating. If anything, she'd just shifted her expression. She started crafting audio reflections, recorded thoughts, spoken with the same care she once applied to brush strokes. Sometimes I'd hear her upstairs, voice steady and gentle, telling stories from her childhood or the early days of our life together. We'd play them back at night, lying in bed, listening to her voice carry us like a soft wave. It was in those quiet moments that I realized how much of our love existed in the spaces between words. It wasn't just the experiences we shared, or the hardships we overcame, but the silences we filled together. The pauses in conversation that no longer felt uncomfortable. The way her eyes could meet mine across a crowded room and say everything. The understanding that if tomorrow changed everything, today would still have been enough. On the morning of her 62nd birthday, I made her breakfast soft eggs, toast with her favorite jam, and mint tea from the dried leaves we saved. In the greenhouse? No. She sat by the window, light falling across her features, eyes calm, expression tender. I handed her a small box, nothing extravagant. Inside was a carved wooden pendant to tree sprouting from a broken faucet, its branches reaching outward. On the back, etched carefully, were the words, "Still growing." She ran her fingers over the engraving slowly, then met my gaze with tear-brimmed eyes. "You remembered," she whispered. I nodded. "What could I forget? We spent the afternoon looking through old photos. Not just ours, but the ones she'd taken in New York, and even a few of her early sketches from college." She marveled at how far she'd come. I marveled at how gracefully she'd held every version of herself. As the sun dipped below the horizon, she turned to me and said, "Let's write something down." Just forced. A kind of ... shared promise. So we did. That evening, we co-wrote a letter, not a will, not a goodbye, but a living document of our love. We titled it For Whatever Comes Next. In it, we promised to always choose understanding before anger, to keep creating even when our hands couldn't, to forgive ourselves for changing, to never let silence grow between us, and to always believe that what we built mattered, even if no one else saw it. We sealed it in an envelope and placed it in the bookshelf, between her favorite poetry collection and one of my old leather-bound journals. That winter was long, but it didn't feel heavy. Our days were slow, yes, but they were full. We read to each other, worked side by side on the final edits of our joint book, second edition, and received letters from former students, some of whom had gone on to become teachers, mentors, and artists in their own right. Evelyn's voice, both literal and figurative, was echoing in places we'd never been. One afternoon in February, while snowflakes tapped against the windows like a soft drumbeat, she turned to me as we sat in the greenhouse and asked, "Do you remember what you said to me the day we met?" I smiled. "You mean after you asked if I'd consider an older woman?" She laughed genuinely, fully. It had been a while since I'd heard that sound. "Yes," she said. "That day, you looked so confused." I took her hand and nodded. I wasn't confused. I was just ... stunned. You were nothing like I expected. And now, I paused, leaned back slightly, watching her face in the fading light. Now I know what it means to meet someone who changes your life quietly, who doesn't crash in like a storm, but drips in like a faucet you didn't think much about until one day you realize you can't imagine the house without it. She chuckled softly. "Gosh, you're really sticking to the faucet metaphor, huh?" I shrugged. "It's kind of our thing." By the time spring began whispering through the thawing ground, Evelyn's energy had shifted again. She tired more easily, stayed indoors more. I adjusted. I brought the outside and fresh-cut flowers from the early blooms. Open windows to let the breeze carry in the scent of earth and renewal. We moved our reading nook closer to the sunlight, and I made it my mission to find audiobooks she hadn't yet discovered. Her days grew quieter, more delicate, but not sorrowful. Just more intentional. And then one quiet Sunday morning, she didn't wake up. She had passed in her sleep, peaceful, her expression soft, the faintest hint of a smile still playing on her lips. I held her hand for hours, whispering memories into the air, feeling both grief and gratitude swirl inside me. The house was still, not hollow, just still. The days that followed were filled with messages, flowers, stories from people whose lives Evelyn had touched. Her students, her neighbors, even distant gallery owners who hadn't seen her in years but still remembered her warmth. I read every letter, replied to each one, and eventually stood before a small group gathered in our backyard beneath the tree she used to sketch when the light hit it just right. I didn't speak of her death that day, spoke of her life. I told them about the faucet, about the question that changed everything, about the art, the love, the stubborn grace with which she embraced every version of herself. I told them she didn't just AI, she evolved, and she made space for others to do the same. I read the letter we had written together. R for whatever comes next. There wasn't a dry eye in the garden. In the months after, I stayed. Not because I couldn't leave, but because the life we built still felt alive in every corner. I kept teaching, kept tending the greenhouse, kept writing. I turned our journals into a final collection, published under both our names. I titled it, "Would You Consider an Older Woman?" Not as a question, but as a statement. Tribute in every now and then, when the wind moves through the trees just right, the greenhouse door creaks softly as it opens, I can almost hear her laugh. I smile, knowing she's still here, not in the air, not in the objects we left behind, but in the rhythm of the life we built, in the pauses between my thoughts, the art still being created in her name. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.